"Damn it," the man shouted, slamming the steering wheel as cold wind whipped through the open window. Beside him his pregnant wife cried out in pain, clutching her belly. The luxury car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, no signal, no help, only silence and fear. His heart pounded as panic set in. Then from the distance a teenage boy appeared on a rusty bicycle. Covered in dust, calm and steady, he stepped forward to help. That moment, one act of kindness from a stranger would change everything. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Drop a comment below and tell me. Robert Steinberg had built his entire life around the belief that everything could be controlled. At 43 he commanded a software empire worth $40 million, employed 200 people, and had never missed a board meeting in 15 years. His calendar was planned 6 months in advance. His backup plans had backup plans. The Mercedes sedan purring beneath him on this crisp October morning was German engineering at its finest, reliable, precise, predictable. But as he glanced at Margaret in the passenger seat, her face pale and drawn with pain, Robert felt the first crack in his perfectly ordered world. "The contractions are getting stronger," Margaret whispered, gripping the door handle as another wave hit her. Her knuckles were white, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "I think we need to go faster." Robert pressed harder on the accelerator, his jaw tightening. Margaret was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and this wasn't how the birth plan was supposed to unfold. They'd scheduled everything meticulously with Dr. Martinez. First babies weren't supposed to come this fast, this suddenly, this uncontrollably. The highway stretched ahead through rolling countryside, bordered by harvested cornfields that looked like stubble against the gray October sky. Robert had chosen this route because it was the fastest way to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 38 minutes door to door according to his calculations. But as they crested a small hill, the Mercedes began making a sound that had nothing to do with German precision. A grinding noise emerged from beneath the hood, low and ominous. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the sound grew louder, more urgent. He'd spent hundreds of thousands on this car specifically for its reliability ratings. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Robert, what's that noise?" Margaret's voice carried a new edge of panic. "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. Robert Steinberg always knew, that's what made him successful. That's what made him rich. But right now, listening to his car's death rattle while his wife labored beside him, he knew absolutely nothing. The grinding became a screech. The screech became a violent shudder that shook the entire vehicle. Margaret cried out as another contraction hit just as the car began to die beneath them. Robert guided the Mercedes to the shoulder as the engine seized completely, leaving them stranded on an empty stretch of highway with nothing but silence and the sound of Margaret's increasingly urgent breathing. Robert turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal. The engine was completely dead. For the first time in his adult life, Robert felt genuine terror, not the calculated risk of a business venture, but the raw, helpless fear of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Oh God," Margaret whispered, and when Robert looked at her, he saw something in her eyes that made his blood freeze. "Robert, I can feel the baby. It's coming now. Right now." Robert fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. 2 bars of signal. He dialed 911, his fingers trembling as he tried to explain their location to the dispatcher. 45 minutes, she told him. Maybe longer. They were in a rural area, and the nearest ambulance was responding to another emergency. 45 minutes. Margaret was making sounds he'd never heard before, low and primal, her body taking over in ways that bypassed all their careful planning. Through the windshield, Robert could see nothing but empty road and harvested fields stretching to the horizon. No houses, no businesses, no help. The man who had built an empire on solving problems, who had never met a challenge money couldn't overcome, sat helpless in his disabled luxury car while his wife went into labor on a deserted highway. His wealth, his connections, his carefully cultivated reputation, none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting help, and he had absolutely no idea how to make that happen. Robert pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and tried to think, but panic was a living thing in his chest, making it hard to breathe, impossible to focus. Margaret's breathing was becoming more labored, more urgent. Time was running out, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Robert Steinberg was completely utterly powerless. The sound reached Robert first, the rhythmic creak of bicycle wheels on asphalt, growing closer through the morning stillness. He lifted his head from the steering wheel and saw a figure approaching through the rear window, a young man, maybe 17, pedaling a rust-covered bicycle with a worn tool bag bouncing against his hip. Robert's first instinct was wariness. The boy was black, thin, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days. His bicycle looked like it had been assembled from spare parts found in different junkyards. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Robert was drowning in desperation. The boy slowed as he approached, his dark eyes taking in the scene with surprising calm. He dismounted and walked toward the car, his posture alert but respectful. When he spoke, his voice was carefully polite. "Excuse me, sir, looks like you might need some help." Robert climbed out of the Mercedes, his legs unsteady. The boy looked even younger up close, but there was something in his bearing, confident without being cocky, aware without being aggressive, that made Robert's panic recede slightly. "My wife is in labor," Robert said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Our car just died. Do you know anything about engines?" The boy was already moving toward the front of the car. "I'm Malik Johnson," he said, popping the hood with practiced ease. "My father taught me about cars." Robert watched in amazement as Malik leaned over the engine compartment, his hands moving with the confidence of someone much older. The boy's fingers traced belts and connections, his eyes methodically checking components that Robert couldn't even identify. From inside the car, Margaret's breathing became more labored. Robert paced beside the vehicle, his expensive shoes crunching on gravel, while this teenager he'd never met worked under the hood like their lives depended on it. "Your alternator belt snapped," Malik said after a thorough examination, pointing to a frayed piece of rubber hanging loose around the pulleys. "When the belt broke, your alternator stopped charging the battery. Once the battery died, everything shut down." Robert stared at the mechanical components as if they might suddenly make sense. His software company dealt with elegant lines of code, not greasy metal parts that could fail without warning. "Can you fix it?" Malik was already digging through his tool bag, pulling out an adjustable wrench and what looked like paracord. "I don't have a replacement belt, but I might be able to jury-rig something temporary." He glanced toward the car where Margaret's distress was clearly audible. "How far to the hospital?" "About 15 miles, Robert replied, his voice tight with anxiety and something that might have been hope. For the next 20 minutes, Robert watched in fascination as Malik worked with focused intensity. The boy loosened the alternator housing, realigned the pulleys, and began fashioning a temporary belt from the paracord. His movements were economical and sure, like someone who had learned that mistakes cost more than just time. "Where did you learn to do this?" Robert asked, trying to distract himself from Margaret's increasingly urgent sounds. "My father's been teaching me since I was 10, Malik replied without looking up from his work. "He says when you understand how things work, you can usually figure out how to fix them when they break." The simple wisdom in those words struck Robert with unexpected force. Here was a boy who couldn't be more than 17, working with tools that had clearly been used for decades, demonstrating a kind of practical knowledge that Robert's expensive education had never taught him. "Try starting it now," Malik said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. The paracord belt looked impossibly fragile around the heavy metal pulleys, but Robert turned the key anyway. The engine hesitated, coughed, then caught with a rough but steady rhythm. The dashboard lights flickered back to life like resurrection itself. Robert felt his knees go weak with relief. "That's incredible," Robert breathed. "How did you know that would work?" Malik shrugged, already stepping back from the car. "My dad always says there's usually a way to fix something if you're willing to think about it differently." Robert reached for his wallet, pulling out a thick fold of bills. His hands were shaking, whether from adrenaline or gratitude, he couldn't tell. "Please let me pay you for this. You just saved my wife and baby." Malik shook his head, already moving back toward his bicycle. The gesture was so matter-of-fact, so completely without calculation, that Robert felt something shift inside his chest. "I don't need anything, sir, just get your family to safety." "Wait," Robert called after him, suddenly desperate to know more about this boy who had appeared like an answer to prayer. You need to drive steady, not too fast. That belt won't hold for long, maybe 20 minutes if you're lucky." "I understand," Robert said, "but at least tell me your name again." "Malik Johnson," the young man replied, mounting his bicycle with practiced efficiency. "Good luck with your baby, sir." Robert wanted to say more, to offer something, to find some way to express the magnitude of what had just happened. But Malik was already pedaling away, his tool bag bouncing against his hip as he disappeared around the curve in the road. As Robert climbed back into the Mercedes, Margaret gripped his hand. "That boy," she whispered, between contractions. "He saved us." Robert nodded, easing the car back onto the highway and driving carefully as Malik had instructed. The makeshift belt held just long enough to get them to Northwestern Memorial, where their daughter was born healthy and perfect 28 minutes after they arrived. But even as Robert held his newborn child for the first time, even as he kissed Margaret's exhausted forehead and whispered words of love and relief, part of his mind remained on that empty highway. He kept seeing Malik's calm face, the boy's steady hands working under the hood, the way he had refused payment as if helping strangers was simply what people did. Robert Steinberg had spent his entire adult life believing that every problem had a price tag, that money could solve anything if you had enough of it. But a 17-year-old boy with oil-stained hands and a rusty bicycle had just saved his family and refused to accept a single dollar in return. For the first time in years, Robert began to wonder if he understood the world as well as he thought he did. 3 weeks had passed since Emma Grace Steinberg entered the world, and Robert should have been the happiest man alive. His daughter was healthy, Margaret was recovering beautifully, and his company had just closed its most profitable quarter yet. The nursery was filled with flowers and gifts from business associates. His calendar was returning to normal. Life was settling back into its predictable rhythm. But Robert couldn't stop thinking about the boy. He would find himself standing by the nursery window at odd hours, watching Emma sleep, and suddenly he'd be back on that highway, watching oil-stained hands work miracles under the hood of his car. During board meetings, his mind would wander to that moment when Malik had refused payment, the simple dignity in the boy's voice when he said, "I don't need anything, sir." The strangest part was what he'd found in his car afterward. Tucked beneath the spare tire was a piece of paper, a mechanical diagram drawn in pencil on lined notebook paper. It showed the layout of the alternator, belt and pulleys, with detailed notes about tension ratios and replacement specifications. The drawing was precise, technically accurate, and revealed the kind of understanding that usually took years to develop. Robert had smoothed out the wrinkled paper and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he'd taken it out and studied it again. The handwriting was careful and neat, the calculations correct. This wasn't the work of some kid who'd picked up a few tricks helping his father. This was the mind of someone who truly understood how things worked. "You're thinking about him again," Margaret said softly from the doorway of his study. She was holding Emma, their daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb. Robert looked up, not bothering to deny it. "I can't shake it, Margaret. He saved our lives and just walked away. No expectation of reward, no angle, no agenda. I've been in business for 20 years and I've never met anyone who didn't want something." Margaret settled into the chair across from his desk, adjusting Emma in her arms. "Maybe that's what's bothering you. You've built your whole life around the idea that everything has a price, then you meet someone who proves that wrong." Robert leaned back in his chair, feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleepless nights with a newborn. "I keep thinking about what kind of life he has. He's obviously intelligent, obviously skilled, but he's riding a bike that looks like it came from a junkyard, working with tools that are older than he is. So find out," Margaret said simply. Robert had tried, discreetly. A few phone calls had revealed that Malik Johnson lived in one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods. His father worked at a small auto repair shop, making just enough to keep a family of 4 housed and fed. The boy had never been enrolled in any of the expensive technical schools that taught automotive engineering. Everything he knew he'd learned from his father and from books checked out of the local library. "What bothers me most," Robert said, looking down at his sleeping daughter, "is that I drive past kids like Malik every day on my way to work. Kids with potential, with talent, with everything to offer, and I never even see them." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. Maybe it's time to start seeing them. That night, Robert sat in his study until well past midnight, staring at Malik's mechanical drawing. The paper was beginning to wrinkle from handling, but he couldn't seem to put it away. Outside his window, the suburbs slept peacefully behind their neat lawns and security systems. Inside, surrounded by the symbols of his success, Robert felt an emptiness he couldn't name. He thought about his own teenage years, the advantages he'd taken for granted: private school, college tuition paid in full, parents who could afford to let him fail and try again. He thought about the confidence that came from knowing there was always a safety net, always another chance. Then he thought about a 17-year-old boy fixing a stranger's car on a cold morning, refusing payment, and pedaling away on a bicycle that looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard. Margaret had been right about one thing: Malik Johnson had proven something Robert hadn't wanted to believe. Not everything had a price. Some people still did the right thing simply because it was right, regardless of what they might gain or lose in the process. The realization should have been comforting. Instead, it made Robert feel small and ashamed in ways he didn't fully understand. He folded the mechanical drawing carefully and placed it back in his desk drawer, but he knew he'd be taking it out again tomorrow, and the day after that, until he figured out what to do with the questions it raised. For the first time in his adult life, Robert Steinberg felt rich in money and poor in something else entirely, and he had no idea how to fix that particular problem. 2 months after Emma's birth, Robert made a decision that surprised even Margaret. He began taking different routes to work, driving through neighborhoods he'd never seen despite working in Chicago for 15 years. He told himself he was exploring the city, getting to know the communities his company served, but he knew the truth. He was looking for Malik Johnson. The search started methodically. Robert contacted auto repair shops on the south side, asking if they knew a young man named Malik. Most of the conversations were brief and polite, but unhelpful. Then on a gray December afternoon, he found Murphy's Auto Repair. The garage was located on a street where the houses sat closer together and the streetlights were fewer. Tom Murphy, the owner, was a man in his 60s with hands that spoke of decades of honest work and eyes that missed very little. Malik Johnson, Tom repeated when Robert asked. "Yeah, I know the kid. Works here part-time after school. Why you asking?" Robert chose his words carefully. "He helped my family a few months ago. I wanted to thank him properly." Tom studied Robert's expensive suit and luxury car with the kind of attention that suggested he'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. He mentioned anything about helping someone, a woman in labor, car broke down on the highway. Tom's expression changed immediately, becoming warmer. "That'd be our Malik. Kid's got a gift, not just with machines but with people. His father raised him right. Is he here now?" Tom shook his head. "School day, but he'll be in around 4 if you want to wait." Robert did wait, sitting in his car across the street and watching the neighborhood come alive around him. Children walked home from school in groups, their laughter carrying on the cold air. Adults stopped to help neighbors with groceries or broken steps. It was a kind of community he'd forgotten existed. People who knew each other's names, each other's struggles, each other's children. At 4:15, Robert saw Malik approaching on his familiar bicycle. The boy looked thinner than Robert remembered, his jacket hanging loose on his frame, but his movements still carried that same calm competence. When Malik saw Robert's car, he slowed, but didn't stop. Robert got out and crossed the street. "Malik, I was hoping to find you here." Malik dismounted his bike, his expression polite but wary. "Mr. Steinberg, didn't expect to see you again. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did for my family." Malik shook his head. "You already thanked me that day on the highway." They stood in the cold December air, and Robert could see that Malik was tired in the way that suggested long days and early mornings. The boy's shoes were worn but clean, his clothes patched but neat. Everything about him spoke of pride maintained, despite limited resources. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said. "Why did you stop that day? You could have kept going. Most people would have." Malik was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "My father taught me that when you see someone in pain you stop, always. No matter what else is going on in your life, that's a good lesson." "He's a good man," Malik replied. Been teaching me about cars since I could hold a wrench. Says understanding how things work gives you the power to fix them when they break. Robert felt a weight settle in his stomach as he began to understand the depth of this boy's situation. Malik wasn't just naturally gifted with machines, he was being systematically educated by a father who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance he could leave his son. Are you planning to study automotive engineering? Robert asked. Malik's expression grew distant. Maybe someday. Right now I'm just focused on helping Dad and learning as much as I can. The careful way Malik avoided mentioning college told Robert everything he needed to know about the family's financial situation. Here was a boy with obvious talent and deep understanding, limited not by ability but by circumstances beyond his control. If there was a way for you to pursue formal education while still helping your family, Robert said carefully, would that interest you? Malik studied Robert's face with the kind of direct attention that made Robert feel like he was being evaluated for trustworthiness. What do you mean? Robert chose his words slowly, remembering his conversation with Margaret about the difference between helping and interfering. I mean, what if there was a scholarship program designed specifically for students like you? Students who have practical skills but need support to develop them further. That sounds like charity, Malik said quietly. It sounds like investment to me, Robert replied. Investment in talent that deserves development. Malik was quiet for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air. I appreciate the thought, Mr. Steinberg, but right now my place is here, helping my family and learning from my father. Robert nodded, understanding that pushing further would only make Malik more resistant. I respect that. But if circumstances change, if there's ever a way I can help that doesn't feel like charity, I hope you'll let me know. I will, Malik said, and Robert believed he meant it. As Robert drove home through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, past houses that grew larger and more isolated with each mile, he carried Malik's words with him. The boy's father was teaching him that understanding how things worked gave you the power to fix them when they broke. But what happened when the broken thing was a system that let good people fall through the cracks, simply because they couldn't afford to climb? That night, Robert told Margaret about his conversation with Malik. She listened carefully, then asked the question that would change everything. So what are you going to do about it? Robert looked at his sleeping daughter, then out the window at his quiet, safe, lonely street. I'm going to learn, he said, and then I'm going to build something better. The following Saturday, Robert made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Instead of his usual route to the office, he drove to Malik's neighborhood with no agenda other than understanding. He parked his car near a small community center and really walked through streets he'd only seen from behind his windshield. The difference was immediately apparent. Here people sat on front porches despite the cold, bundled in jackets but still choosing community over comfort. Children played games that required imagination rather than expensive equipment. Teenagers helped elderly neighbors carry groceries without being asked. It was a kind of everyday kindness that Robert hadn't seen since his own childhood in small-town Ohio. At a corner market, Robert stopped to buy coffee and found himself in conversation with the owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, who seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. You're new around here, she observed. Not unfriendly but clearly curious about why a man in an expensive coat was walking these streets. I'm getting to know the community, Robert replied. A young man from this neighborhood helped my family recently, Malik Johnson. Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit up immediately. Malik, that boy's got a gift, not just with machines but with people. His father's doing a good job raising him and his sister. Little Keisha, sweet girl, smart as a whip. Malik looks after her like she's his own daughter. Mrs. Rodriguez counted change with hands that spoke of decades of honest work. Family's been through some hard times but they stick together. That means something in this neighborhood. As Robert continued walking, he began to see the community through Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. The houses might be smaller, the cars older, the lawns less manicured, but there was something here that his own community lacked entirely: genuine interdependence. People shared resources, not because they had abundance, but because they understood that survival sometimes required pooling what little they had.
He found himself standing outside a small house with a neat front yard and hand-painted address numbers. The mailbox read Johnson, and Robert realized he was looking at Malik's home. It was modest but well-maintained, with flower boxes that had been carefully prepared for winter and a front porch that showed signs of recent repair. As he stood there, feeling like an intruder but unable to leave, the front door opened. A man emerged, mid-40s, wearing work clothes that were stained but clean, his movements showing the easy confidence of someone comfortable with physical labor. This had to be Malik's father. The man noticed Robert immediately, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to polite wariness. "Can I help you?"
Robert felt heat rise in his face. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Robert Steinberg. Your son helped my wife when she went into labor last October." The change in the man's expression was immediate and profound. Wariness melted into warmth, and his eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure. "You're the family from the highway. Malik told us all about that day. How are your wife and baby?" "They're wonderful, thanks to your son," Robert replied. "I've been trying to find a way to properly thank him." Marcus Johnson stepped onto the porch, studying Robert's face with the kind of direct attention that suggested he'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Malik mentioned you'd offered him money. Said you seemed like a good man, but that helping folks isn't about getting paid." Robert nodded, remembering Malik's polite but firm refusal. He was right. "I was thinking about it all wrong." "Come in," Marcus said suddenly. "It's too cold to talk out here and my wife just made coffee." The inside of the Johnson house surprised Robert in ways he hadn't expected. It was small but immaculately clean, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than style. But everywhere Robert looked, he saw evidence of love and care: family photos arranged with thought, books stacked neatly on homemade shelves, a small television that was obviously secondary to the comfortable chairs arranged for conversation. Denise Johnson emerged from the kitchen, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to accomplish much with little. She welcomed Robert with the same warmth her husband had shown, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs that had clearly been washed and reused thousands of times. "Marcus told me what happened," she said, settling into a chair across from Robert. "We're so proud of what Malik did but not surprised. We raised both our children to help people when they can." As they talked, Robert learned about the Johnson family's life. Marcus worked at Murphy's garage full-time, while Denise cleaned office buildings at night to supplement their income. Malik attended school and worked part-time, while also helping care for his 10-year-old sister Keisha. It was a life that required careful budgeting and mutual support, but there was no self-pity in their voices, no resentment about their circumstances. "Malik gets his mechanical ability from me," Marcus said with quiet pride, "but he gets his heart from his mother. She's the one who taught both our kids that helping people isn't optional. It's just what you do when you see someone who needs help." As if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened and Malik walked in, followed by a girl who had to be Keisha. She was all energy and curiosity, her school backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her eyes bright with intelligence. Malik stopped short when he saw Robert, his expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and resignation. "Mr. Steinberg, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I invited him in," Marcus said quickly. "We were just talking." Keisha looked between the adults with the directness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for family stability. "Are you the man whose car Malik fixed?" "I am," Robert said, charmed by her straightforward question. "Malik's really good at fixing things," Keisha announced. "He fixed my bike last week, and Dad's radio and Mrs. Patterson's lawnmower. Mama says he's got magic hands." Malik's embarrassment at his sister's praise was obvious, but Robert could see the deep affection between the siblings. "Keisha, go wash up for dinner," Malik said gently. As the evening progressed, Robert found himself drawn into the family's natural rhythm. Dinner was simple but delicious: pasta with sauce that Denise had made from scratch, salad from the small garden they kept in the backyard, bread that was day-old but served with pride. But the conversation around the small kitchen table was richer than anything Robert had experienced in years. Marcus talked about his work at the garage with the passion of someone who truly loved what he did. He described the satisfaction of diagnosing a difficult problem, the gratitude of customers who couldn't afford expensive repairs, the way knowledge passed from father to son created something lasting. Denise shared stories about her night job, the office workers who'd learned to depend on her quiet competence, the way she'd managed to save enough for Keisha's school supplies by taking on extra cleaning shifts. Malik spoke about his classes with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that education was a privilege, not a right. He talked about teachers who'd encouraged his mechanical interests, about books he'd borrowed from the library to supplement what he learned from his father. But it was Keisha who captured Robert's heart entirely. At 10, she was already showing signs of the same intelligence that marked her brother, but she directed her energy toward different interests. She wanted to be a teacher, she announced, so she could help other kids learn the things that would help them build better lives. As the evening wound down, Robert realized he'd learned more about wealth in the past few hours than in all his years of business success. The Johnsons had very little money, but they had something he'd forgotten he was missing: purpose that went beyond personal gain, relationships that weren't calculated for advantage, the deep satisfaction that came from helping others simply because it was right. When it was time to leave, Robert stood on the front porch with the entire Johnson family, looking out at a street where porch lights glowed warm against the winter darkness. Children were still playing despite the cold, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Adults called greetings to each other from doorways and windows. "Thank you," Robert said to the family, "for dinner, for the conversation, for helping me understand something I'd forgotten." "Understand what?" Malik asked quietly. Robert looked at the young man who had saved his family and then welcomed him into his home despite having every reason to be suspicious of his motives. That the richest people aren't the ones with the most money, they're the ones who've helped the most people. Marcus smiled, extending his hand to Robert. "You're welcome back any time, Mr. Steinberg. Our door's always open to friends." As Robert drove home through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, past houses that grew larger and more isolated with each mile, he carried those words with him. By the time he reached his own driveway, surrounded by the careful landscaping and security systems that separated him from his neighbors, Robert understood that he'd been living in poverty of a different kind entirely. That night, he told Margaret about his evening with the Johnsons, about the warmth he'd found in a house with second-hand furniture and homemade bread. She listened carefully, then asked the question that would change everything. "So what are you going to do about it?" Robert looked at his sleeping daughter, then out the window at his quiet, perfect, lonely street. "I'm going to learn how to build the kind of community the Johnsons have. And I'm going to make sure families like theirs have the support they deserve." The next morning, Robert made a series of phone calls that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He cleared his calendar for the entire day and scheduled meetings with people he'd never thought to consult on business matters: community leaders, school principals, directors of local nonprofits. His first stop was the community center in Malik's neighborhood, where he met Mrs. Washington, a woman in her 60s who spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent her life fighting for her community. "You want to help?" she asked, studying Robert over reading glasses that had been repaired with tape. "That's what they all say at first. Rich folks come down here, take pictures, write checks, feel good about themselves, then disappear when they realize change is hard work." Robert felt the sting of recognition in her words. "I don't want to write a check and disappear. I want to understand what this community actually needs." Mrs. Washington leaned back in her chair, which creaked with age but remained sturdy. "What we need is what we've always needed: jobs that pay enough to live on, schools that prepare our kids for real opportunities, and people in power who remember that we exist when the cameras aren't rolling." Over the following hours, Robert immersed himself in the life of the neighborhood. He helped serve lunch at the community center, where he met single mothers working multiple jobs to make rent and elderly residents who chose between medicine and groceries every month. He sat in on GED classes where adults fought to finish educations that had been interrupted by poverty or family crisis. At Murphy's garage, Tom Murphy let him observe while Malik worked, explaining the economics of automotive repair for people who couldn't afford to replace what could be fixed. "See that Honda Malik's working on?" Tom said, pointing to a car that looked like it had seen better years. "Lady who owns it is a teacher, single mom, 2 kids, car breaks down, she can't get to work. Can't get to work, she can't pay rent. So Malik finds ways to fix what can't really be fixed, charges what she can afford instead of what the job's worth." Robert watched Malik carefully clean and oil parts that a dealership would simply replace, saw him explain to the customer exactly what he'd done and why it would hold for another 6 months if she was careful about maintenance. "Why doesn't he charge full price?" Robert asked. "He's doing skilled work." Tom's laugh held no humor. "Because full price means she can't eat this week." Malik learned from his father that being good at something means using that skill to help your community, not just yourself. That evening, Robert found himself back at the Johnson house, this time invited by the family. They sat in the small living room while Keisha did homework at the kitchen table, and Malik showed Robert his collection of mechanical drawings, precise, detailed diagrams of engines, transmissions, and electrical systems. "I want to design cars someday," Malik said quietly, his fingers tracing the lines of a drawing that showed an engine modification for better fuel efficiency. "Not just fix them, but build them better from the start. Make them last longer, use less gas, cost less to maintain." Robert studied the drawing, recognizing the same precision and understanding he'd seen in the diagram left in his car. "These are incredible, Malik. Have you ever shown them to anyone?" "An engineering professor maybe." Malik's expression grew distant. "College is expensive, Mr. Steinberg. Right now, my family needs me to work and help with Keisha. Maybe someday, when things are more stable." "What if things could be stable, and you could still pursue your education?" Robert asked carefully. Marcus looked up from the television, where he'd been half watching a basketball game. "What do you mean?" Robert chose his words slowly, remembering his failed attempt at simple charity. "I mean, what if there was a way for young people in this community to develop their skills while still helping their families? What if education and community service went hand in hand?" The room went quiet. Keisha stopped her homework to listen. Denise emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What kind of program are you talking about?" Marcus asked carefully. Robert leaned forward, feeling the weight of possibility. "A technical education center right here in your neighborhood. Students like Malik could study automotive engineering and other technical skills while also teaching younger kids in the community, learning and helping at the same time." Malik looked between his parents, then back at Robert. "You're talking about something that doesn't exist." "Then we build it," Robert said. "We build something that should exist." Marcus and Denise exchanged a look that spoke of years of learning to be careful about promises that sounded too good to be true. "Mr. Steinberg," Denise said gently, "that sounds wonderful, but programs like that take money. Real money." "I have real money," Robert replied. "What I don't have is the knowledge to build something that actually serves this community. That's where you come in." Over the next 2 hours, the Johnson family asked Robert every hard question he'd expected, and several he hadn't considered. What would happen if the funding disappeared? How would they ensure the program served local residents rather than outsiders? Who would control the curriculum and hiring decisions? Robert answered honestly, admitting when he didn't know something and promising to find out. By the end of the evening, they had the outline of something that could work, a partnership between Robert's resources and the community's wisdom. The next morning, Robert called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. He walked into the conference room where his executives sat around the polished table, their expensive suits and confident expressions reflecting the world he'd inhabited for 20 years. "I'm starting a foundation," he announced without preamble. "We're going to fund technical education programs in underserved communities, starting with automotive and mechanical skills." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally his CFO spoke up. "Robert, that's admirable, but what's the business case? How does this benefit the company?" Robert looked around the table at faces that suddenly seemed foreign to him. "The business case is that we live in a world where brilliant young people are limited by circumstances rather than ability. The benefit is that we stop pretending that's acceptable." His head of marketing leaned forward. "The optics could be good for the company brand, assuming we handle it carefully. Community outreach, social responsibility." "This isn't about optics," Robert interrupted. "This is about doing something that matters." The meeting grew tense as executives expressed concerns about liability, public relations, and the wisdom of diverting company resources to social programs. By the end of the hour, Robert understood that his team saw his plans as either a publicity stunt or a midlife crisis. That afternoon, Margaret found him in his study, staring at budget projections for the foundation he was determined to create. "How bad was the meeting?"
she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. They think I've lost my mind, Robert replied. Maybe I have. Margaret reached across the desk and took his hand. Do you remember what you said to me the night Emma was born? You said you wanted to teach her that success without purpose is just sophisticated emptiness. Robert felt something settle in his chest, a calmness he hadn't experienced in weeks. Starting this foundation will probably cost me more than I can calculate. Some of my investors will pull out. Some of my clients will think I've gone soft. And Robert smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. And I've never been more certain of anything in my life. That evening, Robert called the Johnson house and asked if he could visit. When he arrived, he found the whole family waiting in the living room, their expressions showing a mixture of hope and weariness. I want to offer you something, Robert said to Malik, but this time, I want to do it right. I want to offer you a partnership. Partnership in what? Malik asked. Building something that matters. A technical education center that serves this community. You'd continue your education with full support, but you'd also help design and run programs that teach automotive and engineering skills to other young people. Your knowledge, my resources, our shared commitment to making sure good people get good opportunities. Malik stirred his coffee slowly, thinking. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Why me? Because you understand something I'm still learning, Robert said. That the point of having skills isn't just to get ahead yourself, it's to lift up everyone around you. You've been doing that your whole life. I want to help you do it on a bigger scale. Malik looked at his parents, then at Keisha, who was trying to pretend she was reading her book instead of listening to every word. Finally he looked back at Robert. If we do this, he said, it gets done right. No cutting corners, no publicity stunts. We build something that actually serves the people who live here. Agreed, Robert said immediately. Malik stood and extended his hand across the small room. Then let's build something worth building. As they shook hands, Robert felt the same sense of rightness he'd experienced on the highway months earlier. This was what Marcus had meant when he taught his son that understanding how things worked gave you the power to fix them when they broke. Sometimes the broken thing wasn't a car or a machine. Sometimes it was a system that let good people fall through the cracks. And sometimes if you were lucky enough to find the right partner, you could fix that too. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks later, buried in the business section of the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, Software CEO's Charity Gamble, Smart Business or Midlife Crisis. The article dissected Robert's announcement of the Steinberg Foundation with the kind of cynical analysis that assumed all charitable work was ultimately about tax benefits or public relations. Robert read the piece over breakfast while Emma babbled in her high chair and Margaret got ready for a doctor's appointment. The reporter had done his homework, interviewing business analysts who questioned the wisdom of diverting resources from core business activities and competitors who suggested the foundation was a desperate attempt to rehabilitate Steinberg Software's image. They're calling it vanity philanthropy, Robert said, passing the paper to Margaret. She skimmed the article while bouncing Emma on her hip. Are they wrong? Robert looked up sharply. You think this is about my ego? I think you're doing something important for the right reasons, Margaret replied carefully. But I also think you need to be prepared for people to assume the worst about your motives. The phone started ringing before Robert finished his coffee. His assistant fielded calls from reporters, investors and board members who wanted explanations for his sudden shift in priorities. By the time Robert reached his office, 3 major clients had requested meetings to discuss the future direction of the company. The first meeting set the tone for what would become the most difficult month of Robert's professional life. Harrison Industries, one of his oldest clients, sent their procurement director with a simple message: focus on business or lose their contract. Nothing personal, Robert, the director said, his tone suggesting it was entirely personal. But our shareholders expect us to work with vendors who prioritize performance over social experiments. This foundation thing makes you look unfocused. Robert felt his temper rise. The foundation is separate from the company's operations. Our service quality hasn't changed. But your priorities have. That's what concerns us. By the end of the week, 2 more clients had terminated their contracts. Robert's stock price dropped 8%. 3 board members requested an emergency meeting to discuss his fitness to lead during this transitional period. The board meeting took place in the same conference room where Robert had announced the foundation, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The polished table that had once reflected his confidence now seemed to separate him from allies who had become interrogators. "Robert, we respect your desire to give back to the community," said Patricia Henning, the board's senior member. "But this foundation is becoming a distraction from your fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders." Robert looked around the table at faces that had once shown him unwavering support. "My fiduciary responsibility is to run a profitable company that serves its clients well. We're still doing that, are we?" asked David Chen, the board's newest member. "Because our fourth quarter projections are down 12%, largely due to client defections that seem directly related to your foundation announcement." Robert felt the walls closing in around him. These people had helped him build his company from nothing, had trusted him through every major decision for 15 years. Now they were looking at him like he'd betrayed everything they'd worked for together. "The foundation doesn't take away from our ability to serve clients," Robert said, trying to keep his voice level. "If anything, it demonstrates our commitment to the communities where we do business." "It demonstrates poor judgment," Patricia replied. "You're gambling the company's reputation on a social experiment that may or may not work." The debate continued for 2 hours, growing more heated as board members expressed concerns about everything from liability issues to public relations disasters. By the time the meeting ended, Robert understood that his board saw the foundation not as an extension of the company's values, but as a threat to its survival. That evening, Robert sat in his study with Malik's mechanical drawings spread across his desk. The young man's precise diagrams seemed to mock the chaos surrounding Robert's attempts to help. Maybe his board was right. Maybe he was risking everything he'd built for a dream that was bigger than his ability to achieve it. Margaret found him there at midnight, staring at balance sheets that showed the real cost of following his conscience. "How bad is it?" she asked softly. "Bad enough that I might lose control of my own company," Robert replied. "The board is talking about replacing me if I don't abandon the foundation." Margaret sat on the arm of his chair, her hand gentle on his shoulder, and Robert looked up at her, surprised by the question. "And what? And are you going to let them?" The simplicity of her question cut through hours of complicated financial analysis and political maneuvering. Robert realized he'd been so focused on what he might lose that he'd forgotten why he was willing to lose it. 3 months ago, I thought success meant having enough money to solve any problem," he said quietly. "Then I met a boy who solved the biggest problem of my life without asking for anything in return. Now I'm supposed to abandon him because helping him might cost me money." Margaret smiled. "There's the man I married." The next morning, Robert called another board meeting. This time, he came prepared with more than financial projections. He brought Malik and Marcus Johnson. "I want you to meet someone," Robert told the assembled board members. "This is Malik Johnson and his father Marcus. They're the reason I started the foundation." Father and son stood in the expensive conference room wearing their best clothes, button-down shirts that were clean but showed their age, pants that fit well but had clearly been purchased for durability rather than style. They looked around the table with the same calm attention Robert had first noticed on the highway, unintimidated by wealth or power. "Mr. Johnson saved my wife's life and my daughter's life," Robert continued. "He did it without expecting anything in return, using skills he learned from a father who understands that knowledge is meant to be shared." Patricia Henning shifted uncomfortably. "Robert, we're not questioning the young man's character, we're questioning your business judgment." "Then let me explain the business case," Malik said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite its softness. "Mr. Steinberg's software helps businesses run more efficiently, right? But what happens when those businesses can't find qualified workers because our education system failed to prepare them?" The room went silent. Malik continued, his confidence growing as he spoke about something he understood deeply. "I know 20 kids in my neighborhood who could design better systems than half the people your clients are hiring, but they'll never get the chance because they can't afford the education that would develop their skills. So your clients struggle to find talent, my community stays poor, and everyone loses." Marcus stepped forward. "I've been working with machines for 25 years. I've seen young people with real talent end up in dead-end jobs because nobody gave them a chance to learn and grow. This foundation isn't charity, it's an investment in the workforce your clients need but can't find. Robert watched his board members' faces as the Johnsons spoke, seeing their assumptions challenged by the reality of intelligence and insight coming from people they'd unconsciously dismissed. After the Johnsons left, the board meeting continued for another hour. But something fundamental had shifted. Patricia Henning asked detailed questions about the foundation's curriculum. David Chen wanted to know about measurable outcomes and success metrics. The conversation had moved from whether to support the foundation to how to make it successful.
2 weeks later, Robert received a call that surprised him more than all the criticism combined. Harrison Industries, the client who had threatened to leave over the foundation, wanted to schedule another meeting. But this time they weren't coming to complain. They wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. "That young man who spoke to your board," the procurement director said. "Word is he's going to be running technical education programs. We'd like to be involved in curriculum development. We need workers with exactly the skills he's talking about." By the end of the month, 3 other companies had expressed interest in supporting the foundation's programs. The stock price began to recover. Most importantly, Robert found himself running a company that was more profitable and more purposeful than it had ever been before. But the greatest validation came from an unexpected source. Tom Murphy called on a Thursday evening, his voice rough with emotion. "Just wanted to thank you," Tom said. "Marcus told me about the board meeting, about standing up for the foundation even when it cost you. That family's been through enough hard times. It's good to see someone willing to share the load." Robert sat in his study that night, looking at the mechanical drawings that had started everything. The cost of goodness, he realized, wasn't measured in dollars lost or opportunities missed. It was measured in the courage required to keep believing that doing right was worth the risk of being wrong. 18 months later, Robert stood in front of a newly constructed building in the heart of Malik's neighborhood, watching as the final letters were installed on the sign above the entrance, Marcus Johnson Technical Education Center. The building was modest but modern, with large windows that let in natural light and workshop bays visible from the street. It looked like what it was, a place where serious learning happened. Malik emerged from the building wearing work clothes and carrying a clipboard, his movements confident and purposeful. At 19 he had grown into his role as the center's lead instructor with natural authority. He'd completed his first year of engineering studies at Northwestern, while simultaneously developing curriculum and teaching basic automotive repair to neighborhood teenagers. "The hydraulic lift is finally working properly," Malik reported, checking items off his list. "The students can start working on real repair jobs next week." Robert nodded, watching a group of teenagers work under Malik's supervision in the visible workshop. Their concentration was intense, their pride in their work obvious. These weren't kids being warehoused in a program designed to keep them busy. These were young people learning skills that could change their lives. "How's the enrollment looking for the new semester?" Robert asked. "Waiting list is 40 kids long," Malik replied. "Word gets around fast when something actually works." The success had surprised everyone except Malik and the community members who had helped design the programs. The center offered technical training in automotive repair, basic engineering, computer networking and electrical work. But more importantly, it offered something that had been missing from most educational programs aimed at low-income communities, the assumption that students were capable of excellence. Margaret approached from across the street, carrying Emma, who was now walking and chattering constantly. The 18-month-old had become fascinated with tools and machines, much to her parents' amusement. "She keeps asking when Uncle Malik is going to teach her to fix cars," Margaret said, settling Emma on the ground where she immediately toddled toward a workbench. Malik grinned, the expression transforming his face. "Give her a few years. By then we'll have expanded the program to include younger kids." The relationship between Malik and the Steinbergs had evolved into something that surprised them all. It wasn't patron and recipient, or even mentor and student. It was family chosen and deliberate, built on shared values rather than shared blood. Mrs. Washington from the community center walked over to join them, her expression showing the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing dreams become reality. "City Council approved funding for the expansion," she announced. 2 more buildings, same programs. They want to replicate this model in 3 other neighborhoods. Robert felt a familiar surge of pride, not in his own success but in the recognition that good ideas could scale when they were built on solid foundations. The technical center had become a proving ground for the idea that education could be both excellent and accessible when it was designed by people who understood the community it served. Marcus Johnson approached from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd become the center's senior instructor, teaching advanced automotive repair while Malik focused on the engineering curriculum. "Robert," he said with the easy familiarity of true friendship, "you should see what these kids accomplished today. They rebuilt a transmission from scratch." "How's Keisha doing in the after-school program?" Robert asked. Marcus's face lit up with paternal pride. "She's teaching some of the older kids basic math while she learns coding. Says she wants to design educational software that makes learning fun for everyone." At 12, Keisha Johnson had become the unofficial mascot of the technical center, moving between programs with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere. She helped younger children with homework in the afternoon and attended advanced computer classes in the evening, her quick mind absorbing everything from basic programming to complex problem solving. As the afternoon light began to fade, the first students of the evening shift arrived. They were older adults who worked day jobs and came to the center for training that might lead to better opportunities. Robert watched them greet Malik and Marcus with the kind of respect usually reserved for much older teachers, recognizing in them people who understood their struggles because they had lived them. Tom Murphy pulled up in his familiar pickup truck, ready to co-teach the advanced automotive repair class. At 72, he could have retired years ago, but he'd found new purpose in passing his knowledge to students who reminded him of himself at their age. "You coming to watch the class?" Tom asked Robert. "Tonight we're teaching them how to diagnose electrical problems. Real hands-on learning." Robert shook his head. "I think I'll head home. This is your world now." It was true in ways that went beyond the technical center. Robert had learned to step back and let the people who knew the community run programs designed to serve it. His role had become what it should have been from the beginning, providing resources and removing obstacles while letting others lead. As they walked to their cars, Margaret slipped her hand into Robert's. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Starting the foundation, changing everything." Robert considered the question seriously. The past year and a half had been the most challenging of his professional life. He'd lost clients, faced board rebellion, and endured criticism from people who thought charity was a luxury businesses couldn't afford. His company was smaller now, but more focused, his wealth reduced but more meaningful. "I regret how long it took me to figure out what mattered," he said finally, "but I don't regret anything that happened after I met Malik." Emma toddled between them, chattering in the way of children who have absorbed more language than they can yet produce. She waved at Malik through the center's large windows, and he waved back before returning to his students. As they drove home through neighborhoods that had become familiar, over months of community meetings and shared dinners, Robert reflected on the circle that had brought them all together. It had started with an act of kindness from a stranger, continued with the recognition that kindness deserved support, and grown into something larger than any of them had imagined possible. The Marcus Johnson Technical Education Center was more than a school. It was proof that when people with resources worked with people who understood problems, they could create solutions that actually worked. It was evidence that the boy on the bicycle had been right about stopping when you saw someone in pain, because sometimes helping one person led to helping an entire community. That night Robert sat in his study with Emma on his lap, showing her the mechanical drawings that had started everything. She couldn't understand the technical details, but she was fascinated by the precise lines and careful measurements, turning the pages with the intense concentration of someone discovering that the world was full of things that could be understood and fixed. "Daddy," she said in her clear toddler voice, "when I big I help people too." Robert kissed the top of her head, smelling the familiar sweetness of baby shampoo and innocence. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what you'll do." Outside, the suburban street was quiet and safe, just as it had always been. But inside, surrounded by his family, and the drawings of a boy who had taught him the difference between success and significance, Robert felt richer than he had ever imagined possible. The circle was complete, but it would never really end. Kindness, once given freely, had a way of returning in forms more beautiful than anyone could plan. And in a technical education center where young people learned that they could fix what was broken, in cars, in communities, in lives, the legacy lived on in the hands and hearts of everyone willing to stop when they saw someone who needed help. The boy on the road had become a teacher, the desperate father had become a partner in hope, and together they had built something worth building.
In a world that often seemed determined to divide people by what they lacked, they had chosen to unite them around what they could create together. And that, Robert understood finally, was what grace really looked like.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.